That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, I've heard you loud and clear. I know people have said, Mason, top 24 wide receiver rankings doesn't help us that much. We need to be going deeper. We need to be talking about some players that we are going to have questions about our flex spot. I've heard you. We're going to try to get through the top end players, guys like Cooper Kupp, Stephon Diggs, that you're starting no matter what. I'm going to try to keep the explanation with those guys very brief. That way we can get a little more players on this list. But of course, before we get into it, you know we have to give away some free Fantasy Flog Network hats. Please, if you have not done so already, go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment giving away free Fantasy Flog Network hats every single video. You should know this by now. Klube and Robert going to be the winners for this video. Just send me that email ASAP with your physical address so I can send that hat to you. And also, you know it already, but this video is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Over there on Underdog Fantasy, they have player props you can check out every single day. If you want to go get in a fantasy draft just for week 13, you can do that as well. And when you go use promo code FLOCK, they'll match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. And this is all with it being available in damn near every single state. Not available in Nevada, Washington State, Wyoming, Hawaii, and maybe one or two other small ones I'm not thinking of, but available in 90% of states that there are. And I think that should be it for the intro. Let's get into this. We got a lot of players to discuss here, and let's lead it off with our wide receiver one in his own tier. Don't need an explanation here. Cooper Kupp, he's been dominant. He's been the wide receiver one. Yes, this past week, this offense struggled. Yes, this team has lost 3 games in a row, yet still at the same time, Cooper Kupp right at the top of the wide receiver points scored so far this season. He had one of his worst weeks of the season this past week, and that was with 10 targets, 7 receptions, 96 receiving yards. Shouldn't be worried at all about the matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And yeah, let's just go down. Let's go to our wide receiver 2 in that second tier. Let's go over to Tyreek Hill. Now, with Tyreek Hill, has a little bit of a tougher matchup against the Denver Broncos, but nonetheless, with Tyreek, he should be fully healthy coming out of the bye week. And at the same time, he's the wide receiver 3 on a points per game basis so far this season. He's shown us the ceiling that very few other wide receivers have. I mean, clearly, I think you should have been betting on the Kansas City Chiefs offensive bounce back from where they were earlier this season. It's not the same offense as 2018 that was breaking records, but still one of the better offenses in the NFL, playing Tyreek Hill as our wide receiver 2. And in that same tier, we are going to have, I mean, someone that's been surging as of late in Justin Jefferson as our wide receiver 3. This past week, he doesn't give you the 37 points that he did the week before against the Packers, but he still did have 9 targets. He had 83 receiving yards. Doesn't get there with the receiving touchdown, but we know with Justin Jefferson, this is going to be a wide receiver that's A, extremely talented, B, commanding a ton of volume in Minnesota, and C, has a great matchup against the Detroit Lions, and maybe with no 1-2 punch at the running back position with Dalvin Cook and Alexander Mattison, and now the fact that it's just Alexander Mattison in that backfield, maybe they decide to throw the ball a little bit more here with Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen, so they'll probably be raising up our rankings. We'll have Jefferson in the same tier at wide receiver 3. Now, going down to our tier 3 of wide receivers, I'm not going to lie, it seems like this is a pretty far drop-off. I would love to know your opinion, but it seems like the top 3, no brainer. You have them in the top 3. But our next guy, we are going to have Stephon Diggs as our wide receiver 4. And with Stephon Diggs here, the reason I'm saying he's not in that same tier is it's just a brutal matchup against the toughest pass defense in the entire NFL this week, and the New England Patriots. Clearly, the Patriots have been dominant as of late. Now with Stephon Diggs, he has one of the highest floors of any wide receiver in fantasy, where his worst week so far this season was against the Kansas City Chiefs, where he had 69 receiving yards and 5 targets at the same time. I mean, coming off a 3-week stretch of 30 points, 20 points, 20 points. I mean, with Stephon Diggs, clearly he's playing in one of the most productive offenses in the NFL. He's the alpha wide receiver. Just the issue is it's a really tough matchup against New England, so I don't think he can be in that same tier as Tyreek Hill. And our next wide receiver will be Keenan Allen. With Keenan Allen, I mean, he has just come out and shown that high floor every single week, and I think that we can have some arguments here to say, oh, well, Keenan Allen doesn't have the same type of ceiling as maybe a few of these other wide receivers on this list, but nonetheless, with Keenan Allen, yet another week with 10 targets. He has not had a week with single-digit targets since week 6. 11, 13, 11, 13, 10 targets in this Los Angeles Chargers offense. Clearly, he's the wide receiver one over Mike Williams. I mean, we shouldn't have bought into the Mike Williams hype at the beginning of the season. He has not had a single week so far this year with less than 10 fantasy points scored. So yeah, Keenan Allen, I think we have to have him as our wide receiver 5. And our wide receiver 6 will be CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb cleared concussion protocol this morning. Should be good to go against the New Orleans Saints on Thursday night. Now, the issue with Lamb is we are going to have a healthy Amari Cooper. We are going to have a healthy Michael Gallup. We're going to have a healthy Dalton Schultz. And with CeeDee Lamb, it's a pretty damn tough matchup against the New Orleans Saints. And for that reason, I don't necessarily think that we can have him up in the same tier as guys like Justin Jefferson and Tyreek Hill. But with CeeDee Lamb, he's demonstrated the ceiling so far this season that really not many other wide receivers have shown. I mean, 28 points against the Falcons 2 weeks ago. And that wasn't with a ton of volume. I mean, that was with only 7 targets, but he gets there with 6 receptions, 94 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. A little bit worried about this matchup, but we just saw Stephon Diggs have a very strong performance against the New Orleans Saints. So we still will have CeeDee Lamb hovering around our top 5 wide receivers. And now our next wide receiver, I know a lot of people are not going to agree with this. Sure, you can argue it. And I am making this video on Tuesday for complete transparency. We're going to have DeAndre Hopkins. Now with Hopkins, of course, we're going to have to monitor the injury reports. We're going to have to continue to go through and just make our adjustments as the week goes on. But I am operating under the assumption. The report yesterday was saying that they're hopeful that they're getting back both Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins. And I'm operating under the assumption that they're both coming back. They're both going to be fully healthy. I mean, I would be very surprised if that's not going to be the case. I mean, with DeAndre Hopkins and Kyler Murray, they have missed the past month now. And keep in mind, I mean, the Arizona Cardinals did not put them on the IR. The Arizona Cardinals did not come out and say, okay, well, this is a significant injury. Let's go through. Let's put him on the short-term IR. Maybe we'll get him back. No, I think it's clearly this team has been dominant even without DeAndre Hopkins and Kyler Murray. The general manager came out and said, you know what? We're going to be about as safe as we can. We're going to be thinking about the future here with how we go through and treat these players with their injuries. Really kind of reminds me of the NBA to this point. It kind of seems like these guys could have come back a few weeks ago, and yet they're just going, hey, we don't need them to go back. This is a playoff team. Frustrating for fantasy football nonetheless, but still at the end of the day, I think DeAndre Hopkins does play this week in one of the top offenses in the NFL. I'm going to have him as a top 10 wide receiver because I think a lot of these other matchups for other wide receivers are pretty damn tough. And if DeAndre Hopkins is healthy and good to go, I think he does have a higher ceiling than a lot of other players. And now our next tier down, going over to Chris Godwin and Mike Evans back-to-back. They're essentially always going to be back-to-back in our rankings here. Both very disappointing this past week. And I mean, I honestly thought that Chris Godwin was one of the best wide receiver options you would have found last week, knowing that you didn't have Antonio Brown and knowing that this was going to be an offense putting up a significant amount of points against the Indianapolis Colts. Well, I mean, both of those things may have been true, but Leonard Fournette scores 4 touchdowns, so it really eats away a ton of what you've had with both Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. We had a question in the live stream last night saying, oh, well, can Evans and Gronk be productive on the same team at the same? Yes, we've already seen that back in week 2 where those two players combined for 4 total touchdowns among both Gronk and Mike Evans. So while yes, the presence of Gronk will negatively impact these wide receivers, specifically with their touchdown equity. Still, I think that you're viewing them as top 10 options, assuming that we don't have Antonio Brown this week, which no reports that I'm looking at are making it sound like we will have Antonio Brown. Of course, if reports come out on Wednesday, Thursday this week, that is making it look like AB should be good to play, then we'll go through, we'll be making adjustments, we'll lower these wide receivers down. But for the time being, they're going to be sitting at the top of this tier for us. In our next wide receiver, someone that, I mean, was a sell high candidate for us earlier this season, and I know people wanted to scream at us for saying it, but JaMarr Chase. With JaMarr Chase, I know a lot of people are panicking. I still have him as a top 10 wide receiver rest of season. I'll have him as a top 10 wide receiver in our rankings now. I think that, I mean, over the past 2 weeks, clearly, I mean, we know the issue in Cincinnati in terms of what you've had from JaMarr Chase. The issue is Joe Mixon is getting 30 carries a game. There's no way in hell that you're going to be able to get JaMarr Chase getting up to his 10 targets, his over 100 receiving yards. I mean, his receiving touchdown. If Joe Mixon's getting to 30 carries, this has been an offense that's been able to go out there and dominate their opponents. I think there's some sneaky shootout potential against the Chargers. Obviously, the Chargers have a much worse rush defense than they do a pass defense, so that is something I want to be pointing out here. But I'm going to be betting on the bounce back with JaMarr Chase based on the talent that he showed earlier this season. I think he will be that high ceiling, low floor player. But we got to go through this a little fast. We got so many players to talk about. Let's go to our next guy, Diontae Johnson against the Baltimore Ravens. We will have Diontae Johnson hovering around that top 10 mark. I mean, with Diontae, I know everybody keeps going, is this man still hating Diontae Johnson? Even though we rank Diontae Johnson as a low-end wide receiver 1 every single week he is a low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2. I don't even know what y'all want from me at this point. I mean, this is just the perfect example of a wide receiver that is getting a volume in a poor offense. Like if you're playing in a non-PPR format, you don't care about Diontae Johnson. But if you're playing in that PPR league, that's where he is going to thrive. I mean, looking at what we have had so far this season, 10, 12, 13, 2, 13, 13, 6, 13, 13, 14 targets. He's had 109 targets through 10 weeks so far this season. Keep in mind, a couple of those games he left early due to injury at the same time. This week in particular, it is a pretty tough matchup against the Ravens defense. However, the Ravens defense is actually much better against the rush than they are against the pass. I mean, if this team's going to be able to effectively move the ball down the field, it should be through the air. But we got to go through this faster. Let's go down to our next tier at wide receiver. Let's go over to Adam Thielen going up against the Detroit Lions. I mean, with Adam Thielen, he's been fantastic. Can't deny it. This past week, gets there with 2 receiving touchdowns yet again. I mean, with Thielen, we had him as a sell high player at the beginning of the season when he's coming off of 4 touchdowns through 3 games. And then whenever he doesn't score a touchdown through a couple game stretch, there, he's clearly a buy low wide receiver. I mean, it's just easy to know what you have with Adam Thielen. This is a wide receiver that has a very large role in the red zone. You've seen his touchdown rate be at a higher level than pretty much any other wide receiver throughout the entire NFL for the past 3 years now. That's maintaining this season where he's had 90 targets and 10 touchdowns. If he gets the touchdown, happy days. If he doesn't, it's kind of whatever. The matchup against the Detroit Lions, maybe this team throws the ball a little bit more considering they don't have Dalvin. And our next wide receiver, we will have him as a low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2. He has been a must-start option for us every single week over the past, I want to say 2 months now, because the only week we told y'all not to start him was whenever you had Devontae Parker back against the Buffalo Bills. And with Devontae Parker and Will Fuller coming back, then you change your mind on Jalen Waddle. And it's a little bit of a different scenario. But until those players come back, Jalen Waddle is just a dominant force in Miami. This matchup in particular, they will be going up against the New York Giants. Not really too concerned about that. And then here with Jalen Waddle, if we're going through, if you're looking at what we've had since the injuries to the combination of Will Fuller and Devontae Parker, I mean, 13 targets, 8 targets, 11, 10, 6, 9, 10. I mean, he's averaging damn near 10 targets a game. A rookie wide receiver, knowing that Tua Tagovailoa will be significantly better than Jacoby Brissett at the same time. You continue to go through and play him. Not worried about the matchup against the New York Giants. He's a must-start wide receiver yet again this week. And our next guy will be Amari Cooper going up against the New Orleans Saints. Tough matchup, tough defense. Also, at the same time, it's not like the Saints are going to be putting up a considerable amount of points, causing the Dallas Cowboys to go out there and throw the ball. I mean, with Amari Cooper, a little bit concerned what the targets look like. If you have a fully healthy CeeDee Lamb, a fully healthy Michael Gallup, fully healthy Dalton Schultz, there are a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. I mean, with Amari, you're not going to be surprised if he's a top 3 wide receiver this week, though. You've seen the elite level ceiling. I mean, going back, remember week 1 against the Buccaneers, 17 targets, 2 receiving touchdowns, 13 receptions, 139 receiving yards. You've seen that elite ceiling, but we've talked about it before with Amari Cooper, a very inconsistent wide receiver. At the same time, you've seen very low floors of 9, 5 fantasy points. Like, he has a lower floor than a lot of other wide receivers on this list, but not many wide receivers have a similar ceiling, mainly because the offense he's playing in. And our next wide receiver will be Terry McLaurin going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. Terry McLaurin, disappointing yet again this past week, but with Terry McLaurin, at the end of the day, the volume is there. I mean, 7 targets this past week, which does mark for his tied season lowest, but nonetheless, it's not like Curtis Samuel, Logan Thomas came back in and completely changed this offense for the Washington football team. Hopefully, this is a little bit of a better spot against the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, It shouldn't be on paper. Just with this Raiders defense, they have been better against the Seattle Seahawks. But when you have a wide receiver like this, you have to continue to go through and play him nonetheless. You're going to be taking the ups and downs. Just thinking about 2 weeks ago against the Carolina Panthers, where he did come away with over 100 receiving yards and the receiving touchdown. Now our next wide receiver, now the wide receiver 1 in Seattle. In this Seattle Seahawks offense, maybe we were too quick to say that it was guaranteed to bounce back. Tyler Lockett. I mean, with Tyler Lockett, clearly you have had Russell Wilson favoring Lockett over the past few weeks. I mean, 115 receiving yards, 96 receiving yards this past week. The volume's not through the roof, however, only 10 total targets over the past 2 weeks. But at this point, I think you have to go through and I think you have to rank Lockett above Metcalf. And with how concentrated the target share is among those two wide receivers in fantasy, I think you have to go through and have a higher expectation on them than a lot of other players, knowing that the Seattle Seahawks aren't looking to get 3, 4, 5 wide receivers involved. It's really just these two options. And if that's going to be the case, you have to respect him with the top 24 ranking. It's a tough matchup this week, though, against the 49ers. Now, our next game going to be the Houston Texans, Indianapolis Colts. Michael Pittman going to be crushing here. With Michael Pittman, not much to say at all. Yes, he had some drop passes this past week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Drop passes are not predictive of what we may be able to expect going forward. We've proven this time and time again in fantasy football that please don't overreact to drop passes. I would rather my wide receiver get open and generate a target than drop that target than never get open in the first place. With Michael Pittman, there's no reason to be concerned. Great matchup against Houston. We're going to be ranking him at wide receiver 16. And then our guy, T. Higgins, with the breakout this past week, going up against the Los Angeles Chargers. Not a massive fan of this matchup, as we previously discussed with JaMarr Chase. I mean, with T. Higgins here, yes, he outproduces JaMarr Chase this past week. And keep in mind, I've been the guy screaming, sell high on JaMarr Chase, buy low on T. Higgins. That was us, 6 weeks ago when JaMarr Chase was coming off a 200-yard receiving game. So don't come out here and act like I'm a T. Higgins hater and a JaMarr Chase fanboy just because I'm not going to be moving as much as the market does every single week. But here this past week, T. Higgins shows us that if you continue to get that volume, it pays off. 8 targets, 6 receptions, 114 receiving yards, and the receiving touchdown. I'm not going to be jumping him up much higher than this. Like I said, I don't really love the matchup against the Chargers. This should be a Joe Mixon game. And our last wide receiver in this tier will be also someone that was on a sell high video for us pretty much every single week earlier this season. Hollywood Brown. I mean, with Hollywood, we were a little bit concerned with the addition of Rashad Bateman and also this entire passing offense in Baltimore. Don't overreact. I think if anything, Hollywood Brown's a great buy low wide receiver right now. I mean, he has had double-digit targets over the past 4 games played, 10 targets, 8 receptions, 51 receiving yards this past week against the Browns. It was the worst game you're going to see from Lamar Jackson throughout the rest of this season. Now, against the Steelers, I know on paper it looks like a really tough matchup, but still at the same time, the Steelers defense hasn't been anything close to what it has been in years prior. So I still think that you play Hollywood Brown every single week. Now let's go down another tier. Let's go over to DK Metcalf and the Seattle Seahawks. Now, like we said, I mean, with Metcalf, of course, you're lowering your expectations. I get it coming off this week. It was horrendous on Monday night, and everybody saw this game. And you know those Monday night, those Sunday night, those Thursday night games, those are going to be the most reactionary ones. That's when people are going to be screaming, Antonio Gibson's now a top 10 running back. DK Metcalf's now a wide receiver you can't start in fantasy football. And with DK Metcalf, I will admit, it's looked that way over the past 3 weeks. With Metcalf, 5, 7, and 2 fantasy points. I get that it's been horrible, but let's take a step back. Let's look at the larger sample here. Let's not overreact and drastically change everything based off this 3-game sample. DK Metcalf is still the wide receiver 24 on a points per game basis. The wide receivers that he is in between, I mean, guys like Robert Woods, DJ Moore, Amari Cooper, Michael Pittman, Calvin Ridley, still in that range. I think that we know with DK Metcalf going to be a little bit more volatile than a lot of other players, but with Metcalf, you really only need that one big play. I still think we rank him as a top 24 wide receiver. I still think you bet on the bounce back. Let's go down to our next guy, Hunter Renfrow against Washington. Renfrow looked great against Dallas this past week. I mean, with Darren Waller possibly not playing this game, I mean, I think you can go through and you can even move Hunter Renfrow up higher than this if there is no Darren Waller, just because the targets are going to be so safe. And the matchup against Washington, I mean, I think it's fine. I am not worried about this Washington pass defense, really. And now our next wide receiver 21, said not to start him this past week because he was arguably the fourth option on his offense. We went through and said, the options are going to be in order. Deebo Samuel, Elijah Mitchell, George Kittle, then Brandon Ayuk. But now the situation has changed. Now Brandon Ayuk clearly going to be the wide receiver one. I still think he's behind Kittle. I still think that he's behind Elijah Mitchell. But nonetheless, with Brandon Ayuk here going up against the Seattle Seahawks, not too worried about this matchup. He had 91 receiving yards this past week off of 6 targets. No Deebo Samuel in this game. So I think that Brandon Ayuk is going to be a completely different week where you can go through and you can play Ayuk. Now our next wide receiver will be Brandon Cooks. He gets there this past week with the receiving touchdown. I honestly think that we should probably have Brandon Cooks in the tier below this. I don't think you can make an argument for Brandon Cooks over Hunter Renfrow or Brandon Ayuk. So Thomas, I'm sorry, let's drop Brandon Cooks the tier below, because looking at since the bye week, he has only been averaging 4 targets a game. Now, like we said, he gets there with the receiving touchdown this past week against the New York Jets, but this should be a tougher matchup against the Indianapolis Colts. Brandon Cooks definitely trending in the wrong direction here. Now, our next wide receiver in this tier will be Mike Williams. With Mike Williams, we kind of discussed this previously, but yes, Keenan Allen, definitely the wide receiver one at this point. And we went through and we looked at that against the Steelers 2 weeks ago. Remember the Steelers, he dropped 20 fantasy points, but we were saying don't get too excited because it was off that one big play that he had at the end of the game. And if you would have removed that one play, he would have actually been a wide receiver coming away with about 7-8 fantasy points. So even with this being said, I think I can make the argument to move Mike Williams a little bit further down from this, because if you're looking at since the bye week, 5, 6, 8 targets. And if you're looking at fantasy points scored, 4, 7, 7, 20. But keep in mind, off that one big play, not great. Now, the Bengals do have a better run defense than they have a pass defense. And obviously, the Bengals offense has been great lately. So maybe this is a shootout spot for the Los Angeles Chargers. And we know Mike Williams does have the ceiling, but he has a really low floor. Let's go over to Darnell Mooney and the Chicago Bears. I know people are going to want to see Darnell Mooney a little bit higher than this. Darnell Mooney has been fantastic over the past month. He has had double-digit fantasy points every single week. And over the past 2 weeks, 121 receiving yards, 123 receiving yards. Now, I will say I'm worried about a couple things. A, this Arizona Cardinals pass defense, very good. B, this Chicago Bears pass offense, very bad. I think that this offense is still capped in general. I still think we need to be avoiding Darnell Mooney where we can. He's going to be a top 24 wide receiver. No doubt he's a top 24 wide receiver, significantly better than I thought he would be coming into the season. I wish we had him on a few more best ball rosters. This matchup against the Cardinals, no, I'm not a fan of. I really think that this can just go sideways for this entire team in the Chicago Bears. And now our last wide receiver in this tier will be Devonta Smith. Now with Smith, yes, it was horrendous for this Philadelphia Eagles pass offense this past week. And something that we discussed in a live stream, I've actually said this in a video as well. Let me go through, and I've memorized this already, so we can just say it. Please, if you're in the premiere, can we all take a collective guess? How many games have you had with over 200 passing yards from Jalen Hurts since the first month of the season? So let's ignore the first 4 weeks. Weeks 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Over an 8-week span, can we take a guess? 200 passing yards. 200 passing yards is nothing. One game. He's had it one game. Now, I will say this is going to be a much better matchup against a New York Jets defense that really can't do anything. So maybe you try to bet on the bounce back from this passing offense. I'll say if you're going to fire some DFS tournament lineups, probably a good idea to get a Jalen Hurts stack in there if he's going to be low owned. Interesting spot. I think that you can go through and you can assume that we're going to get a bounce back. I don't know if that makes Devonta Smith playable though, just because with Smith, obviously this offense can bounce back and really just be through the run game. Now, our last tier of wide receivers, like we said, we're going to try to go a little bit deeper here. We have Van Jefferson going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. With Van Jefferson, we were saying that he was the wide receiver 2 in Los Angeles this past week. We didn't want to be betting on Odell Beckham Jr. I know a lot of people are probably wanting to come out here and wanting to go, Mason, you idiot. Look at what Odell did this past week. Odell got to, 20 fantasy points. Van Jefferson got to 18. I still think in the long term, we want to be betting on Van Jefferson until we see sustained production from Odell Beckham Jr. Van Jefferson also at the same time almost gets to 10 targets in this game. And with Odell, if we're looking at a points per game basis so far this season, of course, this was a little bit of a different scenario earlier this year, but nonetheless, with Odell Beckham Jr., still He's averaging 8 fantasy points per game. He's averaging less points per game than Russell Gage, Laviska Shenault, Kadarius Toney, Dante Pettis, Deontay Harris, Cedric Wilson, Mecole Hardman, Marcus Valdez-Scantling. I mean, he's not necessarily in a range where I think that we can go through and just assume that he's going to be the wide receiver 2 for the Rams going forward. I mean, the volume looked very similar between him and Van Jefferson. I'm going to prefer Van Jefferson for the time being. And our next wide receiver will be Chase Claypool, with Chase Claypool going up against the Baltimore Ravens. Like we said, this is actually going to be a much better run defense for the Ravens than a pass defense, with Claypool trending in the right direction with his target volume. Over the past 2 weeks, he's had 8 and 9 targets. Obviously, this is a wide receiver that has the big playability. I think that just so much of this offense is getting funneled through Diontae Johnson, though. Now, our next wide receiver will be Elijah Moore going up against the Philadelphia Eagles. With Elijah Moore, we got suckered into playing him against the Houston Texans this past week. It wasn't that bad. He did come away with 4 receptions, 46 receiving yards, and 8 targets at the same time. Not a really bad matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles by any means. So yeah, I think we go through. We have the Elijah Moore and New York Jets offense probably in a decent spot. And I think with Elijah Moore, if he continues to get this volume, I mean, 8, 6, 11, 8 targets. Clearly a very talented player at the same time. You can't consider him here. And our last wide receiver is going to be Jerry Jeudy, with Jerry Jeudy. Horrible this past week. Just flat out horrible. And it looks like no Teddy Bridgewater either. Drew Lock coming in. Now, what's nice to see is it's a fine matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs. This matchup against the Chiefs, we know that, yes, their defense has been significantly better as of late, but still, I don't necessarily want to say that with the Kansas City Chiefs, they're going to have a good defense by any means. So I'm going to be going through and playing Jerry Jeudy in this range, just knowing that he is the wide receiver 1 for the Denver Broncos, and maybe this turns into a pseudo shootout. And now, of course, thank you so much for anybody who stuck around for the 30-minute long video. If you have not done so already, please go down there, drop that like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. When you do that, you get entered in to win a free Fantasy Flock Network hat. And of course, go sign up for Underdog Fantasy. When you sign up for Underdog Fantasy and use promo code FLOCK, they'll match up first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. So of course, thank you everybody. Hope you all have a great day, and I hope to see you out in the live stream tonight.